Hi everyone, my name is Mariam Reda, and today I'm going to be talking about post-traumatic stress. So I'll first go into a little personal connection, and then talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and then the implications of neuroimaging research. So first I'd like to talk about my family. I come from a very large Middle Eastern family. I have 50 first cousins. If you were to include my second and third, it would probably go over 100. And I have 25 immediate uncles and aunts. So you could tell how very loud our family gatherings are. But I really want to talk about 2006. So in that year, my family and we were living in New York, and we weren't really around a lot of our cousins. So we went overseas to travel, and we unexpectedly got caught in an international conflict. So from that, we actually had 10 days in an active war zone where we were in about an 8-person apartment, and anywhere from 30 to 40 of us were in there at once. So it was an extremely painful and emotional time for a lot of us. But I was only 9 years old, so I didn't really understand a lot of it. So if you would ask my mom about it, she would tell you about how she was trying to get all her siblings to safety or take care of all of us. But me, as a 9-year-old, I would ask, why aren't we going outside? Why am I playing the same games over and over again in a room? So I didn't really understand enough. But from this really became, it kind of triggered my interest in trauma. So often when you think about trauma, you think about post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's the most prevalent psychopathological consequence of exposure to traumatic events. More than 70% of adults worldwide experience a traumatic event at some time in their lives, and 8.3% of those 70 end up actually developing lifetime PTSD, which is an extremely high statistic. And normally when you think about PTSD, you think about a veteran, but PTSD doesn't start with a war. It just starts with a traumatic event. So there are a lot of different types of trauma that could trigger PTSD. You could suffer from military combat, assault, mugging, or actually being threatened, which my lab classifies as assaultive trauma. Or you could suffer from accidents, natural disasters, or even learning about someone else's trauma could trigger your own PTSD. And that is more non-assaultive trauma. So you go from the traumatic event to symptom onset. And so the DSM-5 is the diagnostic manual for psychological and psychiatric disorders. And in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, you have to go through the following criteria. You have to be exposed to death or threatened death through witnessing, hearing, or even seeing something. You have re-experiencing, which is nightmares, flashbacks, or distress of the event. You have avoidance, which is trying to avoid trauma-related thoughts in your environment or even reminders of it. So, for instance, if you were in a car accident and then just even going into a car could trigger something in a lot of individuals. You avoid trauma-related thoughts or reminders, negative affect, which is isolation, blame, and decreased pleasure in previously pleasurable activities. And you also have hypervigilance, which is almost like being on edge all the time in your environment. So going back and thinking about my family, none of us have been diagnosed or show symptoms of PTSD because a lot of individuals in my family have been used to those type of occurrences. So I always wondered growing up, why did my mom and my memories of the event, why were they so different? And if about 60 to 70% of my family was in that event with us, what caused us all to take something different from it? A lot of us have forgotten a lot of it, and a lot of us know a lot about it and still relive it. So my first question on my journey to my honors thesis was, what influences the way we interact with trauma? So age, sex, education, and the type of trauma like assaultive or non-assaultive, and comorbidities with other disorders and other factors such as biological predispositions, socioeconomic status, or even like the number of traumatic events you've endured in your lifetime. So we have this 3-step process: experience, symptom, and diagnosis. And if the effects of trauma could be looked at on a more holistic level in terms of all those factors and variables, possibly PTSD itself could be looked at on a more holistic level. Then I started thinking about identity and experience. So for my honors thesis, I'm really interested in how identity and experience influence PTSD. And what I mean by that is taking a PTSS participant, which is an adolescent aged 13 to 21 who has symptoms of PTSD, but has not been clinically diagnosed because they do not have enough symptoms to be clinically diagnosed. So looking at them in terms of identity, which is their sex, or their experience, which is a type of trauma, assaultive or non-assaultive trauma, and looking at how that causes differences in post-traumatic stress. So because of that question, I actually became involved in the Psychiatry Affective Neuroimaging Laboratory, or PANLab for short. And in this laboratory, it's a translational clinical psychology lab where we really look at the neural mechanisms and neural connectivity behind the brain in PTSD in order to better understand, one, the disorder, and two, treatments and therapies for the disorder, whether that's therapy or through medications such as SSRIs. And so we use functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, and that's an extremely innovative tool. We're actually able to look at the level of oxygen throughout the brain during certain tasks. So normally a patient will come and they will lie down in a scanner, and over a period of about 6 to 7 minutes, we'll be able to measure the oxygen content of different areas in their brain and look at the different connectivity in the brain. So for my research, I chose 6 different regions of the brain to look at, and all of this has been supported through previous literature. And a really good way to explain it is to think in terms of cognitive processes. So for regulating your emotions and controlling your emotions executively, there's a lot of areas in the prefrontal cortex, such as the medial, dorsolateral, and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. In terms of threat and salience dissection, which is more understanding, is your environment dangerous or is it safe, which is actually something that's very aberrant in a lot of PTSD patients. We see the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, and the amygdala, which a lot of people know as the center for fear and emotion. We also have contextual processing, or also the ability to reconsolidate traumatic memory in terms of the medial prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, and the hippocampus. And finally, learning fear, which has a lot to do back with the amygdala. So this is an example of part of our analyses. This is actually a consolidation of 216 images of adolescents aged 13 to 21. And when we run them through weeks of processing in order to standardize each image, we come up with all of this. So we grouped all the participants together. And this is showing the connectivity from the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So ventromedial prefrontal would be about here. And my mentor and I like to call these all blobs because they're really difficult to understand. And you could see here that from going from blue to red is a difference in connectivity. So anywhere in the blue region is somewhere that has a weak positive connection, and in the red region has a strong positive connection. So here, every single region that lights up is a region that has a connection to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. But then we run it through a lot more statistical analyses, and only about maybe 1 to 5% of these may actually come up significant. This is another image I took last week of the amygdala and all the regions connected to the amygdala, and this shows all the participants. So the way we would analyze this is that we'd look at all the participants first, and then we'd break it up into healthy controls and a trauma-exposed sample. And just a trauma-exposed sample, you don't even need to have clinically diagnosed PTSD, you just have to be exposed to trauma. So it might be a little hard to see, but there even are like significant differences between these two, and when we run them through more statistics, you could actually find out significant connectivity differences. So if you were a different type of health professional, let's say a radiologist or someone that deals with more physical ailments, you would be presented with a patient and you would be able to conduct imaging and do a more comprehensive analysis before you go in for treatment and therapy. But for psychiatry, it's not really that simple. Just getting that image that I showed you of the brain actually took about 4 months of work. So it's an extremely slow and tedious process. And that's also why PTSD is known as the hidden wound. If you were to look at me, you wouldn't know that my family and I had been through that trauma. And there are possibly other individuals in your life who've been through trauma that you don't know about. So it's extremely important for us to use fMRI to really advance the field and understand what's going on in the brains of individuals suffering from PTSD. And fMRI was only really implemented in research in 1990. It hasn't been that long, And definitely there's still so much more that we need to understand, but it's such a revolutionary tool for us to really understand the biological mechanisms behind PTSD. And I think this quote really summarizes it really well. So we now have, for the first time, the ability to make visible these previously invisible wounds. If you cannot see or quantify the damage, it is hard to treat it. So hopefully with the work of my honors thesis and the PAN lab and other labs around the world that use fMRI for PTSD, we could be able to better understand the biological mechanisms behind PTSD. And so we know now that fMRI is innovative and monumental in further comprehending the experiences of patients with post-traumatic stress.